Coming into the year, there were a lot of questions about whether the Giants did enough to address their offense after Buster Posey retired and Kris Bryant departed in free agency. Well, we're more than a quarter of the way through the season, and the Giants' offense rates really highly among the best in Major League Baseball, and Joc Pederson has performed better than many of the top free agents from the offseason. So we'll break it all down next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. Amazing selection, reliably low prices. All the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. So yeah, coming up on today's show, I want to talk about the Giants offense. They obviously exploded in the last couple of games of their series against the Mets. And all in all now, when we look at the season numbers, they come in with a 114 weighted runs created plus as a team, which is virtually tied with the Mets for fourth place in Major League Baseball. The list goes the Angels at 118, Yankees at 117, Dodgers 116, and the Giants and Mets at 114. League average, of course, is always 100 in this number. And so 114 means 14% above league average offense. And this is taking into account park factors, and it's properly weighting the different types of offensive outcomes. But simply put, I mean, if we look at the Giants on base percentage as a team, just by way of example, they're third in Major League Baseball at 331. Their slugging percentage is sixth at 408. The isolated power is ninth at 159. Their walk rate is in the top three. Their chase rate is in the top 3 or 4 in terms of not chasing. And so overall, offensively, they've been able to be a good unit. Has it always been the most consistent? No, they've gone through some droughts where they have had trouble scoring. But guess what? That's called a baseball season. You're going to go through ups and downs. Some amazing numbers I just have to point out, by the way. The Giants have 52 home runs. There's a lot of talk about how last year it was all about home runs, and this year it's not so much. Well, that may be true to an extent, but they are seventh in Major League Baseball with 52 home runs on the season. And what's amazing to me is that they have 4 more home runs than the Dodgers. And also, I mean, you look at the Dodgers have a 116 team weighted runs created plus, and the Giants at 114. So they're right there, neck and neck with that kind of juggernaut-looking Dodgers lineup. And that, to me, is kind of truly incredible. And a lot of it, I mean, at least some of it does have to do with Joc Pederson, who we're going to talk about in detail, and compare him to some top free agents that a lot of you listening probably thought the Giants should have signed, and how he's actually done just as good, if not better, than a lot of them. So there's a lot to say here. I also want to point out the Giants are second in Major League Baseball in runs per game at 5.19. The league average is 4.20. So any way you slice it, this has been an overall good offensive team. If we're going to criticize their performance in any area to this point, look no further than the defense, which I talked about this yesterday, and how we look at all the different numbers, because there's a lot of people don't quite understand. They just say the defensive metrics, and I don't think a lot of us even understand what that means and what these different metrics are, who's making them, that it's actually people behind a lot of these numbers. But you've got your defensive runs saved, you've got your outs above average, you've got ultimate zone rating, you've got fielding percentage, which don't use fielding percentage. These other numbers are much better. Fielding percentage is pretty terrible, to be honest, if you're trying to evaluate defense. If you want to hear why, I talked about that yesterday. But Fangraphs has this overall metric called DEF, and I think a lot of people mistakenly call this defensive WAR, which it's not. It's right next to WAR if you look on Fangraphs, but it's DEF is their overall defensive metric, and it stands for defensive runs above average. And so the Giants come in last in Major League Baseball at negative 19.1. It matters what Fangraphs is using to come up with this number, and that's the case I was making yesterday, that like sometimes your outs above average might be decent, but your defensive runs saved is terrible. And so you kind of have to look between the lines when we are using these types of numbers, but they all, for the Giants, are in the bottom 5. And so I think that this is pretty accurate, and they come in last in this regard at negative 19.1 runs above average. So just an average defense would have saved them 19 runs is what that's saying. And so that has been a problem. And as a result, I mean, the pitching has underperformed. And partially the pitching has underperformed due to, I think, some bad luck. And so you combine bad luck with bad defense, and it's a recipe for allowing more runs than you ought to. But when all is said and done, the offense has been good enough that they've basically won games thanks to their offense in large part a lot of the time this year. I mean, they just won a 13-12 game, for crying out loud. You don't win a game in which the Mets had never lost a game in which they had allowed 12 or more runs in their franchise history, in which they had scored 12 or more runs in their franchise history. And so, I mean, that's just kind of a random factoid, but the Giants offense has been good overall. And something I definitely want to talk about is how there was this false narrative that the Giants had everything go right for them in 2021. Yes, a lot has to go right in order to win 107 games, but we talked about it before the year, and we're going to talk about it again in a minute, how not everything went right, and we're seeing this year how some players who actually had bad years in 2021 are rebounding, and that's part of how the Giants have been able to pick up the slack when you lose a guy like Buster Posey. And we will specifically talk about Kris Bryant as well, who, man, it's not been a good first few months in Colorado. So all of that in just a second. But first, this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure the often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning? Is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? What if you don't know? Embarrassing. And wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? Wherever you go, where they diagnose whatever issue it is, just look up the part on Rock Auto, buy it yourself, save a bunch of money, and have them install it if you want. It's just an absolute no-brainer. I have done it myself literally a dozen times or more. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, as promised, we're going to dive into a bunch of different things, including that the Giants did not everything went right for them in 2021. And that was kind of an under the radar important point because it's just a false narrative. And okay, we're going to explain why that really matters in just a second. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Now podcast. Recaps of MLB games with analysis from our local experts, taking fans through the season like no other network, free and available wherever you get podcasts. So yeah, I mean, this narrative that everything went right for the Giants, and so you can't expect everything to go right again, and so there's going to be this huge drop-off. We talked about this before the season, and I'm going to talk about it again now. Not everything went right for the Giants in 2021 at all. Okay, Mike Yastrzemski, just by way of example, in the truncated 2020 season, he was their best player, and for much of that, quote, year, it was like a month into the year, we were thinking that he was a front runner for the MVP award. Because yes, there was an MVP, even though it was a 60-game season. He kind of fell off a little bit not like he became bad, but he didn't end up winning the award, but he looked like their best player. And then in 2021, he absolutely was not, and it was largely a struggle for much of the year for Yastrzemski. He ended up with a 106 weighted runs created plus, so just barely above league average offense. He also became borderline unplayable against left-handed pitching, and so he became more of a platoon guy who wasn't that impactful. Solid player, good base runner, good defender, but overall just like solid as opposed to a real difference maker. So to say that everything went right, first of all, with regard to Yastrzemski, not true at all. And also, how about injuries? Tommy La Stella missed he missed a lot of time, and he already has again this year, but that's not everything going right. They invested in Tommy La Stella, envisioned him being a big part of their team last year, and he really wasn't because he was hurt so much of the time. How about Evan Longoria missing half of the year? He played 81 games, missed a ton of time. That wasn't everything going right. Kevin Gausman fell off in the second half. But specifically offensively, when you look at, yes, you had great years from Crawford and Posey. And how about Belt? Belt missed a lot of time as well, and that's happening again this year. But there's room for those, even if it's just Yastrzemski, which so far of everyone I just mentioned, it really is so far just Yastrzemski. I mean, currently La Stella is here and healthy, so we'll see if he can stay on the field and stay productive, which he has been so far for the most part. But Yastrzemski has been a difference maker. He's up to, the numbers are really, really good. He's got a 309 average, 409 on base, 500 slugging. Anytime you can go 300, 400, 500 in the slash line there is very good. And as such, he's got a 160 weighted runs created plus, 1.4 Fangraphs wins above replacement already, and projected for about 2.5 more, which would put him at a 4 WAR season, which is very good. About 2 is what you get from an average player over the course of a full season. And he's already at 1.4 through 34 games. His chase rate is a career low. His contact rate is a career high. As such, the strikeout rate is a career low. The walk rate is a career high. Just really, Yastrzemski has had great at-bats all season long. Even prior to the COVID IL, the expected numbers, which again, this is why the expected numbers have value, were showing he should have had much better results than he was having. And so we kind of saw this coming even before the numbers got robust. And Darin Ruff, same thing. I mean, he's kind of righted the ship as well, although he's kind of gone back the other direction. But he was so hot for a while after being so cold to start the year. So anyway, there was room for improvement with many players, even though you lose a Buster Posey, you lose a Kris Bryant, who, by the way, I mean, if they had signed Kris Bryant, it would already be looking like a disaster. And it's not just Bryant. There are several guys. Marcus Semien is another example of a guy who, if they had signed him, I mean, look, there's going to be people complaining no matter what. If you don't sign these guys, Joe is going to complain. If you do sign them and then they perform poorly, I'm going to complain about it, So there's always going to be someone who's got the negative angle on all of these things. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. But it is worth pointing out, I say this all the time, but in baseball, it's so easy to underperform. And it's so fast that some guys just fall apart. And the difference between a very good player and an average player is kind of razor thin in baseball. And if you just kind of get worse in one area, all of a sudden the production just isn't there anymore. So when we're talking about, like, you can invest 1 year and $6 million to get Joc Pederson, who's got a good track record. He's one of the better hitters against right-handed pitching historically. He had many very good seasons in a row with the Dodgers. 2015, 16, 17 was not so good, but 18 and 19. So 4 out of 5 years there, he was a very good player for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And then the last, 2020 was a short year and it wasn't great for him. 2021 wasn't great for him either. So for whatever reason, his value was a little bit down, and you're able to get him for 1 year and $6 million. Whereas you look across the way at a Kris Bryant, and he ends up getting, 7 years, $182 million from the Colorado Rockies. And Bryant has an 82 weighted runs created plus. He's been on the injured list now twice. He just went back on the injured list with a back injury that he injured his back sleeping on a bed in a hotel room, I think in Cleveland. And so, yeah, I mean, there was already injury concerns. He dealt with injuries a lot in the short 2020 season. He went on the injured list at least once with the Giants last year. And the defense was this big red flag. So, I mean, look, I'm not rooting against the guy. I'm just pointing out when I talk about risk, this is what we're talking about. You've just committed 7 years, $182 million to this player, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a nagging injury and the performance hasn't been there. And then Marcus Semien got a similar 7-year, $175 million. The man has a 44 weighted runs created plus, hitting 185, 242 on base, 247 slugging, negative 0.3 Fangraphs WAR. And for Bryant, like I said, the same amount, negative 0.3 wins above replacement per Fangraphs. And meanwhile, we look over at young Joc, who's hitting 260, 331 on base. Those are solid numbers. But then the 606 slugging. He's got a 346 isolated power, which I think places him third in Major League Baseball right now behind, who is it, Aaron Judge and Mike Trout. It's just something ridiculous like that. And so Joc Pederson, you could definitely make a case, has been one of the best free agent offensive pickups so far in the league. And he had the track record. I talked about this 1,000 times, but Dan Szymborski, who does the Zips projections, says that if Pederson had reached free agency just 2 years prior, he would have been in line for like a 4-year, $80 million deal, which, you know, Kyle Schwarber got a deal like that. Nick Castellanos got a deal kind of like that. This offseason, Seiya Suzuki got a deal kind of like that. We'll talk about him in just a minute as well. But there's no reason that Joc Pederson couldn't go back to being that guy, and yet you can get him without taking on the kind of risk. And so it's just understandable. If you're a front office and you see these guys and you're like, wow, we think we're going to get similar production, but it's short term and no risk, because like it or not, these other contracts represent risk. If you've got some sort of budget and you devote a lot of it, not just this year, but down the road to certain guys, and then the performance falls off, that's a problem. And it's kind of what got the Giants into the situation they got into towards the end of the 2010s, when they had a high payroll and a bad team and a bad farm system. And that's kind of the ultimate that you don't want to be in. So the Giants like to maintain this position of flexibility. And I've said all along, it doesn't matter really what you pay these guys. What matters ultimately is the production on the field. I get like wanting stars and that there is value to like marketability. I get that. But look, who doesn't like Joc Pederson right now? If the production is there, I don't care personally. Like, to me, it's all about winning. I want to see them win. And the offense, again, hasn't really been the problem. You could make the case that, you know, Pederson is not a great defender and he's contributing to that number that is the worst in the league. He hasn't been that bad. It's been more Darin and Wilmer Flores and even Luis Gonzalez contributing to that negative defensive number. But anyway, coming up next, we'll talk about Seiya Suzuki, because he, myself included, let me be clear, I wanted them to sign one of these star players, but I also understood that signing a star player does not guarantee that that player is going to have success. It does not guarantee that they're going to be better than a guy like Joc Pederson, who had it in him to be somewhat on that level. And so we'll talk about Seiya Suzuki, because he's another guy I wanted them to sign. He was so good early on in the season, so we'll check in on him in just a minute. But with spring in the air, it's a time of renewal and growth, personally and professionally. As your small business grows, LinkedIn Jobs is here to make it easier to find people you want to talk to faster and for free. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know that every week, nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonmlb. That's linkedin.com/lockedonmlb to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, as promised, I want to talk about Seiya Suzuki a little bit, some other free agents, and just how the Giants have been able to be successful despite not making the big splash for an offensive player. And again, I just want to reiterate, I was hoping that they would, and I was a little bit disappointed by it, but at the end of the day said they should be able to continue to have success even though they didn't go out and make that big splash. And like, what would be, look within yourself if you're someone who's still upset about this, and what would be your reaction if you had signed Marcus Semien for 7 years, $175 million, and the man was hitting 185 with a 242 on base and 247 slugging? What would be the reaction? I mean, it would be, there's so much pressure too that comes with these big deals. You have to be pretty darn sure that the guy is going to be able to produce. Otherwise, it just creates all kinds of problems. And I mean, talking about Seiya Suzuki, this is another example of why there are some things right away that we can tell. Like with Suzuki, it became apparent right away that he was going to be a guy who was able to have good strike zone discipline, which it is clear why the Giants had interest in him, because he's been super selective. And I like the player, and just like with Kris Bryant, I am not rooting against these guys at all. But it's an example of we can't judge these moves and these players a week into the season. There are some things you can say, like, okay, he's going to be someone who's not a wild chasing free swinger. He's going to be more selective. But you can't say this is who he is and this is who the Giants offense is, because a week into the year, there was a lot of moaning and groaning about how Seiya Suzuki was doing great, the Giants offense was looking sluggish, and judge them, right? Like, judge them for not making this move and not overextending themselves and going out there and besting the Cubs offer for Seiya Suzuki. And all you did was get Joc Pederson, and this is atrocious and it's terrible. Well, guess what? At this point in the year, Seiya Suzuki has played in, I mean, coming into today, we'll ignore today's numbers. He went 1 for 2 with a steal and then got taken out. But coming into today, he had a 115 weighted runs created plus, 241 average, 342 on base, healthy on base because of the walks, and 431 slugging. So these are closer to like league average numbers. It's better than average. It's about 15% above average by weighted runs created plus, and 0.7 Fangraphs WAR in 161 plate appearances. So again, Joc Pederson, 60% above average offensively thanks to the enormous power output, 11 home runs in 35 games, and 0.8 Fangraphs WAR in 118 plate appearances. So you're talking about better overall production in fewer plate appearances. There's just no doubt that Pederson has been the better player to this point. Do I know that that's going to continue? No, but I do know that it was too early to judge a week into the season, and it's still too early to judge, but it's a more appropriate time to judge now than it was a week into the season. And I mean, Pederson, look, he's a platoon player at the end of the day. He did start against a lefty yesterday and hit a home run against him in the first inning. So I don't think we even mentioned that. He hit the 3 home runs on Tuesday, and then he hits another home run on Wednesday and was drawing walks as well in that game. He embodied Barry Bonds. After that conversation he had with Bonds, he like turned into Barry Bonds for a couple days. So it's going to be fascinating to watch him continue to go at it in a very hitter-friendly ballpark against a not very good pitching staff. So he could really keep it going with the Cincinnati Reds coming up. So I just wanted to make that point. And there's other guys too, like Corey Seager, who got 10 years, $325 million. He's been meh, 238 average, 305 on base, 413 slugging. Freddie Freeman has been good, but Javier Baez, just everywhere you look. Trevor Story had an atrocious start to the year in Boston, although he's really turned it around as of late. But, I mean, Javier Baez, not that the Giants should have ever been interested in him, and I wouldn't have thought that they would be, given his wild, free-swinging nature. It really doesn't align with what they value in an offensive player. And this deal, as such, that's the third time I've said as such, which I never say. Weird. This deal, 6 years, $140 million to the Tigers, it has a lot of risk when you're talking about a player like this. like I said, if just one thing disappears and this plate discipline stuff is not going to get better at this point. This is who he is. And let's say he just suddenly makes even less contact, or suddenly the power just dips a little bit, which is what we've seen this year, then you're looking at a poor offensive player that you've committed 6 years, $140 million to. He's hitting 201, 241 on base, 321 slugging. So in baseball, it is not as simple as this is a big name, sign him and guarantee yourself success. It does not work that way. You have to be smart, and the Giants have been smart, and they've maintained flexibility. And what I mean by that is they're not bogged down by a big deal that they're just stuck with, even if the player starts to be bad, which at least one of these guys that we're talking about probably won't recover all that well. Like, one of these deals will end up being a disaster, at least. And that's the risk that they don't like so much, and they find these undervalued players. Like I said, with Joc Pederson, the only reason you got him for 1 year, $6 million was because of a couple of down years, but he's still kind of young, and he was just a player who was closer to $100 million performer, and they probably believed that they could get that type of production, and so far they have. So that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast Locked On MLB on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. So easy, helps me out a lot. So thank you in advance, and thank you to everyone who's done so already. I cannot wait to be with you again tomorrow. We're going to be doing a mailbag, so look out on Twitter for the prompt. Thanks again for listening today. Stay Locked On Giants.